Hello, everyone, and welcome to the last session of the Banguoja conference. It's lovely to have all of you here, and thank you so much for joining. So we're closing the conference with a session that we called Creative Talks, Telling Challenging Stories. And in the upcoming hour, we will have the chance to discuss and dive into bringing difficult subjects, difficult topics, and difficult conversations to the table, bringing them into audio format. And we will hopefully find some answers or some more questions, which is fine as well, about connecting with interviewees, talking with vulnerable groups, and bringing unseen, undiscussed topics to the surface, and also protecting yourself as a creator, protecting the story and the storyteller. So these are some of the questions that I'm hoping to get to during the session. And today with me, we have three wonderful guests that I am very happy and privileged to present to you today. So without further ado, we have Emelie Rosén, who is an award-winning investigative radio reporter at the Swedish Broadcasting Corporation. Her stories often focus on issues that are important, but those that are not as much as represented in the media. So she talks a lot about youth, children, and violence. And these are some of the topics that we will discuss today. And in the program of Banguoja Audio Festival, we have one of her pieces called Gamer. So Emelie, hello.
Hello. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you for joining. Also today with us is Martyna Šulskutė, who is a producer and editor of audio documentaries. She has a background in social anthropology. She studied at the University of Southern Illinois and Lund University, where she studied social science. And Martyna is interested in investigating nature, environment, religion, ethnicity, and alternative social movements. Martyna, thank you so much for joining.
Oh, happy to join.
And last but not least, we have Sayre Quevedo, an artist and a journalist who works across mediums to tell stories about intimacy, identity, and human relationships. He currently works as a producer for Vice News. And in 2018, his piece Espera, Wait in English, received the Third Coast RHDF Director's Choice Award. And overall, the list of awards, national and international, that Sayre has received is very, very long. So we're very grateful and happy to have you today. Hello.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
And before I forget, my name is Agnė Pakšytė. I am project coordinator at the Lithuanian Center for Human Rights, and I will be moderating the conversation today. Before we jump into all of the necessary and interesting questions that we have, I want to also encourage you to ask questions. The session will definitely be richer and more meaningful if you share all of the concerns and questions and ideas and insights that you have. So do not hesitate and please ask questions that arise. You can do that at the Q&A section, which you will find at the bottom of the screen. And at the end of the session, I hope we will have some time to answer your questions, but ask them at any time. The earlier I see them, the earlier I can voice them. So I think there's that for the introduction. And to start the session, I think it would be very interesting to hear a little bit about the pieces, about your works that we have in the program. So Sayre, I would like to start with you. And in the program of Banguoja Audio Festival, we have your piece, Wait. Could you please tell us a little bit more about it?
Yeah. So first of all, thank you again for having me. I'm really excited to be in conversation with everyone here. So the piece that I have in the festival is called Espera. Originally it's called Espera, in English is translates to Wait, and it is a short documentary, both an audio documentary and a video documentary. There's kind of several versions of it that exist in different mediums, and it is essentially a conversation between me and an ex-lover on the last night of on the night of our breakup, essentially sort of discussing both the nature of the relationship itself, and then also sort of these other larger themes that popped up, I think, that pop up in general around being a gay man, essentially around ideas of loneliness, around relationships, and just societal expectations. And I think that's probably the most that I can say without completely giving away the whole thing.
Thank you. Thank you. Emelie, we have your piece, Gamer, The Murder Plan. Could you tell us a little bit more without, of course, giving it all away?
I will give it a try. So briefly, it's an investigative podcast series or a documentary series that deals with, it's about when things really go south in gaming communities for children and youth, and no adults are there or try to understand or take responsibility or even talk to the children or youth that have been affected. And when I mean go south, I'm talking about a school attack is planned and carried out, recruitment for white supremacist groups, sexual abuse. So it's tricky. It's really heavy stuff. And through the project, I interview and follow several young people, children and youth. And I don't only have to deal with the general difficulties with having young interviews with young people. You also have to figure out how to do it when talking about these subjects with both victims and perpetrators. And that line in between them might also sometimes be a bit blurred. So as you can imagine, lots of challenges arise, and I'm looking forward to talking about some of them today.
Thank you. And lastly, Martyna, in the program, we have your audio story, Message from the Blackbird, Genocide of the Romani People in Lithuania. We would love to hear a little bit more about it.
So basically that was my first documentary episode, and it tells the missing part of the story, how it's told in Lithuania, or at least in student books in schools, that mainly talking about Holocaust. Roma people are skipped or just briefly mentioned somewhere in one sentence. And the biggest problem is that it's a group of people who can't vocalize themselves well. So to speak about their experiences and what's maybe still possible to remember, or what's still possible to grasp, to get from people who maybe not remember themselves, but maybe they heard the stories from their close surroundings of Holocaust experiences. So it's an episode about this part of the story of history.
Thank y'all, and I think these brief introductions into your work really explain why the panel looks the way it looks, why the panel about bringing difficult conversations to audio telling includes all of you, because it seems like your work includes difficult storytelling in one way or another, whether it is very intimate and very close to home, or whether it is kind of socially heavy, historically heavy. So the question that I want to start with is what drives you to tell these difficult stories in your work? And whoever wants to start, please go ahead.
Okay, so I can just briefly, to me, as an investigative reporter, my job is to, my assignment is basically to do that. But then to add another layer, I'm really passionate about finding ways for, finding space for people to bring up what is most important for them, and especially people that usually don't have that public power and don't take such a big part in like public discussions or the political debate. And I think that, to generalize a bit, when it comes to young people and children, that is really a group that we should be better at representing in public spaces. And I can be totally mad about how, like, I've heard so many stories and probably done this myself, that when I start interviewing a kid, I kind of transform and start to talk in a different way and don't even give enough space for that person to reflect and answer difficult subjects in a serious way. So to be a part of developing that and be able to bring up what is really, really important for children and youth and things that they might have problems discussing or being heard about, that's something that really drives me. And the project Gamer, that's part of this audio festival, is one example of that.
Thank you. Sayre?
Yeah, I can see from my perspective how it was that I think that the main problem in Lithuania's media is that Roma people were basically represented as a group, never as individuals. And for me, investigating and telling this story was not only revealing or getting to know better myself what was missing, but also to get to know people, to get to know characters who can tell the story, and to hear them as individuals. And I would say even this, although this part that is in this festival, it's maybe still more experts talking, but then there was the second part of this podcast, which was one Roma woman talking and explaining her story and coming public, which is not so often in Lithuania for Roma people. So for me, hearing individual stories and telling individual stories of people who are seen as a group was a big drive.
I feel like my answer is a little bit like probably an amalgamation, or like, I mean, obviously I think there's like a common thread in sort of like all of our, what's bringing us to these stories in particular. And obviously my work, I mean, in my professional life, my work is, you know, can be very third person in that way, but my more personal, you know, the stuff that I do on my own is a lot of the time much more personal. And I think with that personal work in particular, it's very much those two things that you brought up, right? This idea of, especially as someone who is queer, as someone who grew up in a really very particular sort of like within a very particular family history, within a very particular sort of like set of social circumstances. I think like often the way that we talk about people can be very flattening. And I just know in my own lived experience that like life is never as flat as it seems from the outside. And so I think I come to this work, and especially work around documenting my own experience, from a place of sort of wanting to complicate some of that narrative a little bit, and to show that, yeah, like that life is kind of messy no matter who you are, right? And it's rarely as sort of simple or as sort of narratively clean as we would like it to be. And so, you know, when I'm making work about myself, I think the aim is to really try to provide a short glimpse into into how messy life is in some ways, and how sort of how difficult it is to sort of put it into the boxes that we often put them into, to sort of tell the stories that we want to tell, and you know, and it's, there's challenges in that as well. I think there's you know, there's challenges in trying to box any sort of complexity into, you know, into a 45-minute or a 30-minute or a 10-minute work, but that's the aim, or at least that's the goal.
If I might add that, I think that's a really important point when we talk about how to meet the people we interview as well, because I think like getting rid of your own preconceived notions are one of, at least for me, that's like a core thing to work with when dealing with these difficult subjects. Yeah,
no, definitely. And also moving away from the part of yourself that like wants simple answers, because I think it's like very easy to go I think we all do this to an extent, right? Of like, we meet someone and we sort of are like, oh, I mean, I think journalists especially, I'm speaking for myself, right? Like, I think it's very easy to go in like, oh, well, I already know, I kind of know what the story is about, right? And then you sort of take away the opportunity for that person to complicate your idea of what the story is, or what, you know, who they are. Yeah, constantly fighting that instinct, right? To like, to sort of like decide what the story is before you've actually heard it in some ways, I think is an exercise that we do constantly in this work.
Yeah.
And I think what you're saying also relates to what we heard Latif Nasser saying yesterday in the session, in the conference. He was telling about a colleague who was looking for a person to fit a specific narrative, which is very popular, that a teenage person is rejected by their parents, by their family, because of their queerness. And that's when they become homeless as a result. And so she was interacting with youths on the street looking for a story like that, and the colleague couldn't find one because all of them were much more complicated and had so much more to them than just this simple plot. So I think what you're saying also relates heavily to that. Yeah.
But to be a bit, sorry.
I just wanted to add to this that probably what you expect in the beginning and what attracts you in the beginning is hard to distinguish from what you finally gain from the story, and what how it surprises you in the process and afterwards. So at this point, when the story is made, at least for me, it's difficult to remember what was the original encouragement, because now it's everything what happened in the process also.
Mm-hmm. Emelie, and you were saying?
Yeah, I just wanted to on a positive note, I do think that like looking at the media landscape, we are moving towards a climate like with a lot more spaces for podcasts or articles or any kind of documentaries with so much more grayscales. The black and white is going out, and I'm so happy for that.
Definitely. And to dive deeper into the very genre of audio storytelling, I want to ask if you think that the design of the genre itself is somehow suitable or specifically more comfortable to bring difficult stories to the table, and in what ways do you think audio as a genre serves these difficult conversations?
Like sometimes when I need to find a way to articulate something difficult, I close my eyes, and I think maybe you can relate to this. And when audio works at its best, I think that's what we are doing. Like you are able to introduce the listener not only to a narrative or like a story in that sense, but to introduce the listener to a whole new world, to see the world from another perspective with other people's eyes, and get so close without that person even having to like expose his or her face if that's something that person doesn't want to. So in that sense, I actually do think that audio is like really suited for this, but also I'm biased because I'm in love with working with audio.
I agree. I mean, I think I think a huge part of why I'm drawn to, or have been drawn to, audio as a medium for so long is also is that it kind of contains these two very both seemingly sort of separate but also very interconnected elements, right? Which is that it's very universalizing to hear someone's voice, as opposed to, like, I think we carry bias no matter what, right? Like, I don't want to say that audio completely removes bias, but I also think like removing the sort of physical barrier of like whatever that instinctual part of us that is conditioned to judge people based on what they look like or how they're, presented visually and everything that comes with that. There's a very universalizing sort of element to it, in that like hearing someone's voice first, as opposed to like seeing the way they dress or where they're located in a visual frame or whatever, I think is really beautiful. And then, and then the specificity of the human voice and how unique each human voice is to a person. There's just something very, like, I feel like the word intimate is used very often to describe it. And I think audio is very intimate. But I also think that there's something that is like much more connected to like broader humanity, right? Because there's a sort of closeness that brings us to an individual, and a sort of opening, right? Like in that, like, this could be anyone. Like you could, this could be any person on the street. You have no idea because you don't know what they look like at all. And I think, and I think what you said, Emelie, as well, of just the comfortability in certain situations, like in my work in Wait, for instance, I don't think I could have done that piece in video, because the person who I was speaking with is going through a very, is in a very particular situation in which sharing their identity would have been, really, I think, really bad for them. And audio allowed a certain amount of comfortability in that relationship, in that conversation, that if I'd pulled out a camera and tried to talk to us, I don't think that conversation would have looked the same at all.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that in my case, when that was a very historical episode, leaving sound without images, it allows those images for listeners to create, because otherwise to make a historical recreation or some video would be absolutely difficult. And also, as a part of it was a recording from archives of an old woman remembering her story from concentration camps. That required quite a lot of editing, so video would not be possible to be edited that much and to be concentrated or extracted that much as audio allowed to do that.
And I want to come back to something that we've already mentioned briefly, which is working with the bias that you may have, and both Martyna and Emelie mentioned that it's sometimes difficult to overcome your own bias to the story and to sort of forego the initial construction of how you think the story might go. So I want to ask, how do you work with your own bias when coming into a story?
I mean, I think for me at least, I take a lot of time. I mean, with my work, my professional work, I guess all my work is professional work, but like my sort of like 9 to 5 work, there are deadlines and there's sort of like urgency that exists to make things. But with the stuff that is sort of more personal, I've been really lucky in those spaces, and then also in my own life, to have the privilege of time to really like to step away and then come back, and step away and come back, because I think that space is necessary in order to fully hear a story, because you become wrapped up in, for better or worse, at least I can only speak for myself, like you become very wrapped up in the emotional world of whoever you're recording or whoever you're talking to, and including your own emotional connections to the story you're trying to tell. And so being able to work at something and then, take a couple of days off, walk away from it, and then come back and really listen to it with fresh ears, I think is a really important part of the practice, and a really important part of being able to recognize that and ask those questions, because it's very hard to honestly ask yourself about your own biases when you are just like so engaged with the material and so engaged with the emotional world of the thing that you were trying to tell. But yeah, I'm curious about other folks, how you sort of deal with that.
I ask for help a lot, and I mean, for me, that's an important part of the process, not to not be the one making all the decisions, and I mean, not only in the last phase, but I usually discuss how all the interviews and conversations go with my closest boss and editor. I ask people to ask me all the tough questions and really play the devil's advocate during the whole process, not to get locked into one position, because I think it's becomes more and more difficult to really have an open mind if you are later in the project when you realize that you might have been affected by a bias. But I also think like we have to be sensitive and aware of that this is an actual issue that we have to think about all the time. I mean, I think we are naive if we don't think this is something difficult to handle. At least that's my opinion. I think help and be a team. Even with like personal stuff, I think like invite people into the process and really be open with that. I want you to ask the tough questions.
Mm-hmm. And Martyna, you mentioned before that sometimes to you it's difficult even to distinguish the idea that you had before going into a story and then what comes out. So that suggests to me that you have this way of approaching a story with a very open mind. So what tools, what methods, strategies do you apply?
In a way, I think I would agree with that. With this, that for me, coming to the topic with open arms, or how to say, to both sides, or both or possible opinions, and hearing them is important. And of course, on the other hand, I would say that other thing is maybe for me to have a topic or have a question for a while in my head, to go through it through different phases myself before starting working on the topic. And some topics I would probably would not work, knowing that I haven't been with the topic enough myself before, that it's maybe too fresh. I have never considered it. It was not actual for me. Then I would not probably take the topic, or would take it with a lot of spare time for it to have a distance at some point.
I also think, I mean, I feel like it's also worth mentioning, in my opinion at least, like I think it's also impossible to completely escape bias altogether. So I think like finding ways to acknowledge your sort of presence within the work, to sort of remind the listener, like there's a person here, and that person is also, I don't think it necessarily means for instance, in my case, like, oh, you know, putting yourself into the work all the time. But I think also down to things like, we're talking about a medium, right? So like editing in a way that suggests, like, sort of like suggests the invisible hand of the editor, or reminds the listener, like, there's a person here who is editing this thing. Like, I think, you know, with weight, for instance, and I've done this with other work as well. Like, I try to like leave little tiny sort of reminders within the actual piece itself that sort of says like, hey, like, there's one person driving this thing, right? Like, there's one person, like, if someone else in the story had the steering wheel on this and had been editing it, maybe it would have sounded completely different. But like, hello, I'm here. Like, I'm making this because I feel like to sort of like pretend like we don't exist in the work, or pretend like we're not bringing our own sort of ideas and feelings and certain biases is sort of it takes away from the richness of the work as well, because it's like, you're not just sort of like an automaton, like, you know, sort of like emotionless robot who's like producing a thing for people to listen to. You're a person who also has emotions and feelings, and those things are going to impact the way that you tell that story. So I think finding ways to acknowledge that, as opposed to trying to completely ignore them, I think is also a really is a strategy as well. Of course, that, like, you know, depending on the sort of outlet or the way that you choose to share the work, like that, those the ability or the willingness of the people around you to actually do those things is probably going to be really different. But at least in personal work, I think it's especially important to sort of like show people like, I'm the one editing this, I'm the one who's making this thing, and I try to do that in little tiny subtle ways in the work.
I think that's a great point. I was thinking also about the problem, or like the difficulties when you approach a subject that you might not be very familiar with. So like, just to give an example of how we worked like with the gamer, because I was previously not very familiar with the gaming world, and I was really terrified of being caught up in like stereotypes or preconceived notions. So I early on, first of all, I rejected this story for a while, even though I felt that it was an important story, because I was afraid of those issues. When I actually decided to, okay, let's do this, one of the most important calls I made during the whole process was that I will not be the one driving the investigation and deciding what is important. That must be the kids living in this world. So I kind of hold on to one 14-year-old boy's hand during the whole process, and asked him about, like, when I found something out, I asked him about it. What was his interpretations? And the issues that the young people brought up to me, those were the issues that I brought with me and started to investigate, like in a more conventional journalism way. But they were the ones deciding what is important for us. And something maybe not very common that we also did in this case, because I did talk with many kids for many hours, but there are limits to what you can do to decide, like, is this only like one perspective? So I actually also created a survey, and I picked a sample of 20 schools around in Sweden, and did a survey with 1,000 kids in 6th and 7th grade about these issues. And of course, that's not like in depth, but at least we could see that the people we have like extensive talks with and create this in-depth journalism with, the issues they bring up is something that are familiar to many more. And that was important, just to like make sure that it wasn't my preconceived notions that was driving this project, if it makes sense.
It does, and I think these are very important points that you are all bringing. Since we're about halfway, we're in the second half of the conversation. Since I have to keep an eye on the clock, I will remind all of our listeners and viewers that you can ask questions. You can either use the chat function or the Q&A function, and share your questions or insights with us. And on that note, we did receive a question which also aligns to something that I wanted to bring up. So the question goes, how to reach the listeners who have different skeptical opinions about the audio documentary, about the topic that the audio documentary is talking about? Is it possible at all? And I think this is a very, very interesting question, because I guess creating an audio documentary, a good one, the one that represents the point of view of the subject, of the story, of the owner of the story, is one thing, but then how to make sure that there are ears to listen to that quality documentary. So if anyone has any points, please.
Sorry, no, you go ahead, please.
Yeah, I think that in my opinion, there are no documentary stories which are about only single person, that each single person has the story which tells also the stories of listeners in some way, that each story is touching listeners in maybe different ways, different aspects, but so I don't know if that's possible to change the perspective of a listener from the title or from the name of the documentary, but listening, like when they are in the documentary, then it has to touch in a way, I think, because it's never only about the person about whom documentary is, but it's also about listener.
Yeah.
I would say
I feel resistant to the idea that we have to convince people to think things are important, or to I think it's helpful to think about the listener, definitely on an auditory level, on a sort of experiential level, but in terms of like convincing them of the importance or the veracity of the thing that you're making, I just feel like it's a hindrance to think in that way. Like I make things, and I don't mean this to sound sort of nearly as pompous as it's going to come off, but I make them for myself as a listener and as a producer, right? Like I'm creating the thing that I would want to listen to, and if you can relate to it, that's amazing, and if you can't relate to it, that's unfortunate. But like I think yeah, I'm squarely against the idea of like convincing people to do anything. Like I think that if I've done my job, you'll listen and enjoy it, hopefully, and get something out of it. And if you don't, then that, maybe this isn't the documentary for you. Maybe there's another documentary that is, more up your alley. But I guess I feel like the audience is important in a lot of cases, but when you're making the work, for me at least, it's not nearly as important at all. And that might just be as a result of the kind of work that I make. But I'm rarely thinking about sort of like audience in the broader spectrum. I'm thinking more about the people who are in the work itself, and myself, and how I feel about the work.
Mm-hmm.
I think that for me, and this is something that has followed me during my whole career in audio, and that is, for me, it's always one of the most important steps when deciding how to tell the story and do the editing is the first minute. And when I find like the tone that I want to represent the whole story, and like the thread of like how this story will be told, that's often done in the first minute. So it's not like 100% related, but a bit related, I think, like to find that tone from the first second. I think that is important, because just to be pragmatic, whether we want it or not, at least from our data, like it suggests that if people don't like the first seconds, I mean, there are few seconds you have before they skip it. So no long drag introductions. Just wanted to add that.
Mm-hmm.
Like a hook, I mean, yeah, a hook will take, I mean, a hook, and I don't mean that in like a sensationalist sense, but like, yeah, like really, I mean, I agree with that. Like, I don't think of it in terms of like, convincing or not convincing them to stay, but I do think like with anything, right? Like the first minute, I mean, a film or an essay or a novel, like, yeah, it's rare you're going to get past like minute 5 or page 5 if you're not, if you're not somewhat drawn in. So I definitely agree. I spend a lot of time working on the first couple of minutes of something just to make sure that works.
And I would also agree with that. Convincing maybe is not the main aim, as also then there would be a challenge of to stay true, not to lie, because if the main purpose is to convince, then what are the means of convincing? So for me, I would say telling the story how I experienced it, how I understood it, how I heard it. So it's really personal, but it's never convincing, or it should not be convincing.
So I think what you all are sort of leaning to is this authentic approach to storytelling, that telling the story the way it was perceived by you and by owner of the story. I keep using this term owner of the story. I'm not sure if it's accurate, but I don't know. I can't find a better term. So yeah, so this authenticity of storytelling. But then my follow-up question, and I think somewhat related to the question that we got from a listener, is that what do you hope, or what do you what do you hope the reaction or the response of the listener is? Because even if I assume that even if you're not talking about the audience in a broader sense, or you're not thinking about this, like, I don't know, big social change that you're hoping to influence with your work, you're probably still thinking about the response or like the experience of listening of the listener. So I wonder, I'm curious to know, what do you hope the experience, the response is when you're bringing a sort of a difficult subject, a difficult conversation to audio?
For me, it's often, I have, like, at least my experience is that it often like prompts new discussions. Like one of the most wonderful like responses I've got is like the letters, emails, phone calls, with Gamer as an example, often like about families that say, like, for the first time we are talking for real at the dinner table about this part, like this part of my kid's life that's a huge part of their life, and I haven't even made sure that they know I'm interested and want to know what they are experiencing there. That's just one example, and I think that's one of the more powerful, for me, examples. Then, of course, as an investigative reporter, also working a lot with news, like reactions from authorities, like changes in laws, and those kind of things are also pieces of the puzzle. And I don't think it's like a bad thing to think about that, like, before finishing up the story, because sometimes you realize that this story that I'm telling, if I wanted to think about what would be needed if this should change, then you might actually have to add some new pieces to that puzzle that you first of all didn't figure out was part of the story, but it's needed to, like, information needed if you want people to be able to drive a change. Then you are not the one as a reporter responsible for creating that change, but you provide like necessary information. So for me, it's useful to think about that in the process of finishing the story.
I think I'm much more concerned with the sort of like emotional journey that I bring people through, and the responses that I mean, first and foremost, I'm concerned with the response of the people in the work, right? Like I want them to, I hope to hear something from the people that I include, especially because they are often familiar to me, right? So like lovers, friends, family members, like I would like to know that I have sort of like truthfully and authentically shared part of their story or their role in a story that I'm telling about myself in a good, in a truthful way. And then secondly, I think the responses that I most sort of identify with, or that I most enjoy, are also like or hope to have are people who see themselves in the work as well, and who would come up to me afterwards and say like, wow, like I thought I was the only person who had gone through something like that. I'm so happy to have something like this, to be able to see myself in something like this, because especially because my work tends to sort of lean towards the ultra specific and sort of like these liminal spaces and identity and relationships. I create that work. I mean, going back to sort of your first question about like, why do we do this? I think also part of it is that I don't see myself, and I don't see these sort of complicated sides of myself in a lot of media. And so being able to like, to be that for other people, and to have them say like, hey, like I really, I watched it and it really reminded me of things that I've gone through myself, I think is a really powerful and very, again, like sort of like gets back to the sort of universality of the story and the medium as well. This idea that I can go through and document a whole life experience, and someone else listens to it and is like, wow, I see myself in that thing, I think is really, really powerful.
Mm-hmm. Martyna, do you have anything to add about what kind of response do you hope from the listener when you're putting your work out there?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm really expecting certain reactions or responses, but of course this emotional closeness or emotional bond between listeners and people who talk is for me important. That in a way I expect listeners to sympathize and to like people who are telling their stories, and also what we were talking at some point, I think Emelie was saying about the world not being white and black, which is sometimes overrepresented in the media as white and black. So also bringing more colors or shades of all colors to listeners is important. And so finally, for me, if they recognize it, is satisfying.
May I also take the opportunity to get into the persons interviewed, as like on the note of like feel represented?
Mm-hmm, of course.
Okay, because to me, I think it's very, very important, and I think that like transparency, honesty, and like the notion of no surprises when it's broadcast or published are so important aspects. So I mean, of course it depends. Like I don't usually go to a sit down with like the top politicians and listen to it before it published. But when it comes to, for example, the kids interviewed in this project, I always try to call them and talk through it in advance, or maybe go out and meet them and play it for them, and then we discuss it. And I mean, these things take time, and I actually think it's a bit scary as a creator sometimes. But I think it's so important not to skip it, because in general, to build confidence also with these people that might not be used to media or used to be interviewed, I think like honesty and transparency and explaining again the context of the interview and why you want to talk to that person in particular are very important, the aspects of building that relationship and confidence that you need if you want to tell the story as truthfully as possible.
Yeah,
definitely. Go ahead.
Oh no,
I think
having that building that into the way that you make the work is so important. And it also shows a certain, I think it's a really good indicator of your own confidence in the work. Like if you're afraid to show it to the people who are in the work, like how confident are you about that work, you know? I really try to be, because also it's, you know, people give a lot. We're asking a lot of people when we interview them, when we share their stories as well. And so like having the trust to share or even have a conversation and say, hey, like this thing is coming out and this is what it's about, I think is really, really important.
Mm-hmm. And Martyna, you were saying?
Yeah, I was just saying that I would agree with this, that, and I sometimes say it, that for me the most important listener is the owner of the story. So he or she is the most important listener, and if they accept it, then other listeners are, I'm more relaxed with other listeners.
And we have a question from a listener or a viewer, which relates quite heavily with what we're talking about right now. And the question goes, do you ever worry or think about the effect that publicity will have on your interviewees, and do you take steps to protect them? How, if so? So I think we touched upon the subject. Sayre, you were saying that in certain cases, the stories that you've chosen wouldn't be possible to broadcast in video to protect the identity and privacy of the storytellers. But overall, how all of you deal with protecting the interviewee?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'll say in terms of my work, like I've done stuff about my family, and I've done, you know, there's certain situations where like Wait is a situation where the person was anonymous in the work, but there are other situations where the person is not anonymous in the work. And I think for me, at least, there's only so much protection that you can provide, right, to people. I think that the ultimate form of protection is like honesty, right? Which is to say, you know, to be upfront about the fact, like this will go out into the world and this will be this many listeners. Like, I just want to make sure you're comfortable telling your story and being honest about that aspect of the work as well. And then as Emelie has pointed out too, like having conversations with those people throughout the process too, like I think making yourself as available as possible to the people that you include in the work is a form of protection, because unfortunately we can't control how people respond to things, and we can't control how they'll react. All we can do is sort of like show that we will not disappear after the story goes out into the world, or at least in my case, like I try to be as present as possible to kind of show like no matter what happens, like I take full responsibility for whatever happens out of this work, and I'm here for phone calls or for emails or what have you.
I would also say to wait and evaluate the material that I have really carefully, because sometimes people say more, and they added that I don't want this to be public, so I'm just saying it for you. So of course I would not use this material, or would ask people if they haven't changed their mind, but I would not really push people to say more than they want. And also some other things that people say, but I feel that maybe that's too much, and maybe they haven't evaluated context carefully themselves, then I would also try not, then I would skip these parts of material, even they would be maybe intriguing or something, but I would really evaluate the context in which their words might end up, and
I think that this issue is something that keeps me awake at night more and more, because I do think that we have a climate where people like such a polarized debate climate, that I know that there is a genuine risk of people having to deal with really bad situation due to publicity. Often, like in investigative work, it's people that actually have made something like wrong, made a bad decision, maybe something illegal or criminal. But still, to know that you're reporting, after you're reporting, to see like the threats and the people's family get drawn into it, I think it's a worrying development. And I don't have any easy or clear answers of how to deal with it, but to think about it I think it's important. At least I think about it a lot and do discuss it a lot with my boss, colleagues, editors. And then when it comes to more like core persons in like storytelling and documentaries, I have talked a lot about when talking to kids. I do think that's applicable to other kinds of interviews, especially interviews with people not really familiar with like media, and also people that have experienced trauma. And one thing that I have noticed is that when you ask questions to a person that person never has been asked before, the chance is pretty big that that person also starts to tell you things that person never told anyone else before. And if you are talking to a 13-year-old, that 13-year-old might have forgotten that you 2 minutes ago explained the context of a radio documentary and a podcast and what it will sound like. And 2 minutes later, that person is telling you something he or she has never told anyone else before. And you ask something back and you realize, okay, so this person really doesn't want his or her mother to know that. I mean, we can't have it in radio if it's really important that his or her mother doesn't know about it. So like, just be aware of that situation. I usually try to like pause in the interview, repeat what has been said, that shows in a sensitive way, that shows that I have been listening. If I have any interpretations, I ask, are they correct? So they can correct me immediately if not. And also, like, I can check, is this something you're willing to have in the piece? And if this is done in a sensitive way, that builds confidence that will get you closer and closer to the core. At least that's my belief. And also protects you from having to find yourself in a situation when someone like feels really, really misunderstood.
Yeah, well, I think what you're saying is incredibly important to keeping the privacy and to keeping the safety of the owner of the story and the story itself. Thank you all. As I'm peeking at the clock, I see that the session is almost over. So I don't want to leave the conversation entirely on the note of protecting the story, and I want to voice that it's also very important to protect the other side, which is the side of the creator and your own mental well-being and emotional well-being. And I think we had also a brilliant moment yesterday in the session. Agnieszka Jacquemet was one of the panelists, and the question came up from the audience about the well-being and emotional well-being of the creators. And she said that in 25 years of working in the radio, she's never thought about the question. So I want to leave you with the question and wish you to take the best of care of yourselves. And thank you once again so much for joining the session. It was great having you here. Thank you. And to all of our viewers, thank you for tuning in. Thank you for asking questions and joining the sessions, this one and all of the previous ones in the conference. You will be able to access the recordings of the sessions on the conference's website, which is banguoja.lt. And also, I'd like to remind you that you can access the entire program of the festival also on the website banguoja.lt. So you can check out the works of Emelie, Martyna, and Sayre there, as well as many other audio documentaries and stories. So thank you all so much. With these words, we're closing the entire conference. So thank you to everyone who tuned in, and Judita and Carolina. Thank you for always being behind the screen and taking care of the broadcasts, and see you soon.
Thank
Thank
you
you so much.